Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Dr. Deidre Denny, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Transylvania University here in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to discuss the documentary CURED. Before I introduce my most esteemed panel, I want to share a couple of rules of engagement for our time together. Audience participation is strongly encouraged. At the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon that says Q&A. Please put any questions you have for the panel in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that I read them out loud during our Q&A session. Secondly, there is a live transcript button at the bottom of your screen that says CC for closed captioning. Please engage that button as well if you'd like to have closed captioning. This video is being recorded and will show up later on the YouTube channel for Transylvania University. So now that that's out of the way, I want to welcome my wonderful panelists. First, I'll introduce Mr. Patrick Salmon. He's the co-producer and co-director of CURED, a resident of Washington, D.C. He previously served as creator and executive producer of Codebreaker, an award-winning drama documentary about the life and legacy of gay British codebreaker Alan Turing that reached more than 3 million viewers worldwide. Hello, Patrick. Bennett Singer is our second panelist. He's a Los Angeles-based filmmaker and the other co-director and co-producer of CURED. Bennett's previous credits include co-directing Electoral Dysfunction, an award-winning film on voting rights, and Brother Outsider, a documentary portrait of the gay civil rights activist Bayard Rustin that premiered at Sundance and won more than 20 international prizes, including the GLAAD Media Award. And last but not least, a warm welcome to Cole Rucker, who is a Transylvania University alum who served as an executive producer of CURED. He has more than 20 years of experience in the creation and implementation of treatment programs for adolescents and their families. To honor the life and legacy of Dr. John Fryer, who was another Transylvania alum, Cole established the Fryer Fund for Diversity and Inclusion here at Transy. This fund was created to support and protect the rights and well-being of students who come from historically marginalized groups. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. This is our alumni weekend here at Transy. We haven't had one in a couple of years, it looks like. And so we decided to do it despite COVID rearing its ugly head and making us do some things online that we would have preferred doing in public. So I'm really pleased that you all were able to join us today via Zoom to have this very important discussion about a movie that I know in the advertising, it says it's fascinating, it's moving, it's riveting, it's all of those things, and it also will piss you off. I shared with Cole earlier that I've got questions about some of what I saw. And I've watched the movie 3 times because I wanted to make sure I heard what I heard, if you will. But we'll start some questions. And again, audience, feel free to use the Q&A function on your screen to engage in this conversation. So my first question is for Patrick. What was the catalyst for CURED? Why did you want to tell this story?
Well, Deidre, I appreciate the question, and really a big thanks to Transylvania for hosting the film. And it's really great to be with Cole. And of course, it's great to be with Bennett too, but Cole especially, because, you know, we wouldn't have gotten this film done without his support and partnership as an executive producer. So it's really been a humbling experience working on this film and telling this story, because it's really one of the most important moments in LGBTQ history. As long as we were classified as mentally ill, then business and government were going to use that as an excuse to discriminate. And the roots of this film idea actually are connected to John Fryer. And so it's especially appropriate to be presenting this film at Transylvania. A friend of mine in Washington in 2014 named Charles Francis showed me a screenplay that he had written about the life of Frank Kameny. Charles is president of an organization called the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C. And you know that from the film was one of the, that was the organization Frank Kameny started in the 1950s. Well, Charles has reincarnated it now, and it's focused on preserving LGBT history. So his screenplay about Kameny's life featured the scene which is shown behind Bennett, the photo of the 1972 APA annual meeting in Dallas, where John Fryer had to disguise himself as Dr. Anonymous in order to testify to his APA colleagues about what it was like to be a gay psychiatrist. And it really was a turning point in this fight. But reading, I was familiar with this story, having read LGBT history books, but this scene jumped off the pages after reading my friend's screenplay, and I immediately thought this would be an incredible documentary idea and an important story to tell. So I recruited my friend and now colleague Bennett to join me. And you know, it's been a 5-year odyssey to get this film made. I actually like to joke that it took us longer to make the film than it took the activists to convince the APA to change this classification. So it's been quite a journey, but we really hope that we've done justice to the people like John Fryer who worked together and joined forces to achieve this momentous victory.
Thank you. So that leads me right into Bennett. You know, tell us about the production process. Patrick's told us the journey was 5 years in its making, but tell us about the production process, the search for the materials, how long, I'm sorry, not how long, but what are some of the most notable discoveries you encountered during the course of your research in producing this film?
Absolutely, and I would echo Patrick's thanks. It's really such a pleasure to be here in this context and to be sharing the story and thinking about its meaning and significance with folks from the Transylvania University community. So thank you for making it happen. Yes, as Patrick has already said, this was an odyssey, a long project. Raising the money was quite a challenge, but then doing the research and figuring out how to tell the story was another major challenge. Certainly one of the big priorities was finding the participants who lived through this history and brought it to life, and highlighting their voices and their testimony through interviews. And we tracked down quite a number of central participants in the story and were able to do interviews with them. Dr. Fryer himself had died close to 20 years ago, so that was not, interviewing him firsthand was not a possibility, although we did find some archival material for him and other people who had already died. But I will say that of the 15 or so people that we've filmed interviews with, 5 have subsequently died. And so I think that really does underscore the timeliness of this project, and the fact that if we hadn't done it when we did, it would have been impossible to tell the story with that first person testimony to the extent that we were able. And then in terms of the research and the content, there were quite a number of discoveries and goals. One thing we wanted to do was really portray the treatments that gay and lesbian people were subjected to. It's one thing to have a historian or a narrator say gay people were subjected to treatments, but we wanted to personalize that. And so we did find witnesses who had gone through treatments such as electroshock therapy. And we have a man from Oklahoma and a woman from Connecticut. And I think even that juxtaposition tells part of the story. It really did affect people, or could affect people across the country, men and women, rich and poor, black and white, across a lot of different strata. And there was this looming threat that, if you were gay or lesbian, you were automatically classified as mentally ill. And then therefore, the world of psychiatry was saying you could be cured, and people interpreted that and took that into their own experiences in different ways, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not voluntarily. But we did want to portray those treatments and help people understand really what the stakes were. We also had one storyteller in the film who didn't go through electroshock therapy, but I would say was brutalized in another way, in the sense that her mother said, when she was 14 years old, either you're going to a mental institution to cure you of this malady, or you could take option B, which was to marry a man, and they falsified her documents, and she was actually 14 years old, even though that's not what the, what was presented to the city clerk or the marriage office, and she was indeed married to a man. So I think that is another example of the consequences of this diagnosis. And then we had an amazing team of archival researchers who did turn up some great footage. Another of our goals was really going beyond the sort of canon of visual material that turns up understandably in so many LGBT history films. And we, this was a different story with potentially different archival elements. And so there are a few, I think, treasures in Cured. I know I'm biased, but there is that segment from the David Susskind show, for instance, where you have 7 out lesbians appearing for the very first time on American television. It was a TV moment as well as an LGBT turning point. You have these 7 out lesbians who were so self-assured, so self-confident, so determined that, to tell both David Susskind and America that they were indeed healthy and happy and well-adjusted. And no thank you when David Susskind basically offered to, personally intervene. And, he couldn't quite wrap his head around the idea that women might not want to be with a man, so that I think is a great moment. And you see Ron Kennedy and you see Barbara Giddings pushing back against his smugness and his certitude, which I think was emblematic of really American society in general. David Susskind was sort of the standing in for the establishment in that scene. And then another really, amazing discovery that ties into this discussion in particular was when Patrick and I spent close to a week going through the 217 boxes in the John Fryer collection that have been donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. There's hundreds, literally hundreds of boxes, and we found some great material to tell that piece of the story, photographs, diary entries, really to bring him to life. But in this little box labeled miscellaneous audio, it was kind of a shoebox with cassettes, unlabeled cassettes. I sat there with this old cassette recorder listening to tapes, and miraculously enough, there was this audio of Dr. Fryer giving his legendary speech as Dr. Anonymous in 1972. And apparently even the Historical Society, even the archive, did not know that they had this treasure in their collection. And it was such a such a momentous moment for us, because we had been thinking, like, what actor can we get to try to recreate this moment? But I think no actor could have really done justice and portrayed that in an authentic and genuine way. To hear his voice, to hear his emotion, to really understand the risk he was taking, because he really could have lost his medical license. He could have been fired. He had already been fired. And so I think to hear his voice deliver that electrifying testimony is priceless. And so that was one of the most heartening and really, gratifying and momentous discoveries on our long journey. And I could go on, but I will stop there, landing on the Fryer moment, which I do think is such a great piece of the storytelling. And we're so happy that we were able to include his voice in that form in the film.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack some more of the movie because, like I said, I have questions.
Which we want to discuss.
That I want to discuss today, absolutely. But you ended, at the end, you talked about Dr. Fryer. So Cole, when did you first learn about Dr. John Fryer and his role in the campaign to remove homosexuality from the DSM? How did you, were you like, I'm here at Transy and everybody's talking about Dr. John Fryer, or you were in the archives looking for something and you took a class from Dr. Fryer, or was he even still here? Tell me about you and Dr. Fryer and how you even came to know about him.
Sure, and thank you so much for being here. It's a real honor to be able to be a part of this process and be a part of this wonderful film that Patrick and Bennett made. I learned about John Fryer after I left Transy and went to graduate school. And I was sitting in class and we were reading about this person who made this great contribution to mental health. And I had never heard about him the entire time I was at Transy. And I learned that he was a Transy graduate. And so I had been sort of beating a drum for a while to try and get proper recognition for his contribution and at Transy. And in much later years, Tim Collins is working in the development department, and I asked him if we could possibly do something to honor John's legacy. And Tim provided all that leadership, did an amazing job, and we were able to get that up and running. And it's so gratifying, and I love that the university is moving forward in so many positive ways. And I think this is one of the most important ways. And I know when I was at Transy, in part because I was studying anthropology, I left there with a great understanding, or well, not great, but some understanding of the importance of diversity. And it sort of, I think, put me ahead of many of the people I was working with in different areas of mental health, and made that a centerpiece of mental health. And so it all, for me, comes back to that experience at Transy. But and I will say this, and then I'll give the floor back. But when I was there attending school in the early 80s, this discussion would have happened maybe inside of an abnormal psychology class. It would not have happened anywhere else. Things were very conservative at that time socially, and I'm really just so heartened at how Transy has evolved, and their commitment to diversity means a great deal to me. So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that you should know, and our audience should know, is the Fryer Fund is something that we do use for Project One. That's the logo that is behind me, for activities for students to do diversity, equity, inclusion types of activities and initiatives. And through this fund, we've been able to do a few things. We have a campaign called I Belong, so that all students, regardless of who they are, where they come from, have an opportunity to tell their story of why they belong at Transy. So that's one way that we use the fund. We have other activities that happen on campus that use the fund. And then today, this opportunity for, even though this is alumni weekend, we still needed to be here. And the Fryer Fund allowed that to happen today. So this particular event that we're having today is also because of the Fryer Fund. So thank you for starting the fund, you and Tim and everyone else. I'm not sure if Tim is on the line today. I don't think he came to Kentucky for alumni weekend, but he may be in the audience. We make sure that we want to tell people thank you while they're around to hear the thank you. Give them their flowers while they're here, right? Because without that kind of forethought for you, for Tim and everyone, then we wouldn't be able to do the things that we do now for our students. And our students, we have a group called T-Unity, and they live loud and proud on our campus. And so that's wonderful, right? It's not something that they have to do in an abnormal psychology class. They're not having to meet, off campus. They have a huge banner that is in our brand new campus center. And they're recognized as a community member at Transy, and we just love it. So I'm going to tell the audience, there's a couple of questions and I'll get to those in a second, but spoiler alert, because I'm about to talk about some of the stuff that happened in the movie that I'm like, it was like I had to wrap my head around it, which is one of the reasons I watched the movie 2-3 times. So in the movie, it talks about, in the documentary, it talks about that homosexuality is a mental illness. It's a mental disorder, and it's in the DSM, and as such, and that the psychologists of the time were saying that in order for this phenomena, this disorder to happen, it meant that you had to have a dominant, seductive, possessive mother. Well, as a mother, I got a problem with all of that, as you can well imagine. And that marriage is a cure. So who of the three of you wants to handle the question of, the treatment for homosexuality? And I'm going to outline a couple of other things. So marriage is a cure, talk therapy, electroshock, castration, lobotomy, sleep with a woman who is warm, soft, and easy, and then institutionalization for several years. None of that sounds like a cure to me. I mean, I'm sorry, it just doesn't. But your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to comprehend a world where that was the conventional wisdom. And I think, Bennett alluded to it earlier, but we really wanted to highlight for people that these weren't just words in a book. These words destroyed lives, they harmed people, they caused psychological damage, they caused people to have increased rates of suicide. Bennett alluded to the story with Reverend Kennedy, which is just so shocking. And then we highlight the story of Dr. Charles Silverstein, who in his 20s is a school teacher and knows he'll get fired if it's revealed that he's gay. And so he ends up spending 3 times a week, he goes to a psychoanalyst trying to get cured for 7 years. You just think of literally thousands of hours. And one of the most compelling recollections he has is reflecting on the damage he did to the women that he met at the encouragement of his therapist in an effort to get cured. And so thinking about all the lives that this affected, but also remembering that this was the view of society at large, this was the view of the medical establishment, this was the view of APA members. The experts we spoke with told us probably 95% of APA members at the time would have believed that homosexuality was a mental illness that could be, quote, cured. I think another important point to talk about is this talk show that we mentioned with Reverend Kennedy, where she's on television with 6 other out lesbians. And this sort of view of David Susskind is so illustrative of how pervasive this view was throughout society, because Susskind was considered a progressive, a sort of forward-looking talk show host who was representing these progressive views. And yet on this issue, he stuck to this notion that it was a mental illness. So it is so hard to comprehend that this was the view of people, but it's sort of what makes all our blood boil is that this was the view of the vast majority of the so-called experts. And it really is tragic to think about all the lives that were destroyed because of this view.
The oppression of women, the just not acknowledging that women have a choice, have a life, have a say, have a desire to even be in a relationship with a man, much less to be used as a cure for something that is not a disease or a sickness, yet in the books it was at the time, right? So Bennett, the film documents the arguments that Frank Kemeny called the shabby, shoddy, sleazy pseudoscience that underpinned the mental illness classification for homosexuality. But there was a political component to this story. In your view, was the DSM fight about science or politics?
Great question. Yeah, and I think in some ways it was both about both of those realms. Science and politics absolutely were part of this, this whole story. But I would say really the fundamental argument was about science, because both sides in the debate were claiming that they had science on their side. The proponents from the APA, like Charles Socarides and Irving Bieber, were these medical doctors, and they were out there saying, you know, this is a curable mental illness, and we have scientific data and studies to prove that or to support that argument. And then along came Frank Kameny, who was an accidental activist. He had gone to Harvard and gotten his PhD in astronomy, so he was a hardcore scientist himself, and was working for the government, as we show in the film, until he was fired under this executive order that the US government had put into effect, saying that if you're gay or lesbian, you are unfit to serve your country, so you must be purged. And that's what happened to Kameny in the mid-50s. And that turned him into an activist. And so he was, you know, when you think about the workings of history and the process of social change, what a perfect person to be mobilized and to think about the role of science in this particular conversation. And so Kameny looked at the arguments that the proponents were putting forward, and he was able to cut through them pretty quickly. You know, like he looked at the samples of these studies, and they were not controlled scientific studies. They were very skewed samples. Like if you look at 100 gay people, but all of those people are seeing psychiatrists because they want to get cured. Like that is not a representative starting point to make a scientific conclusion about the mental health of gay people. And it seems so obvious and like sixth grade level science, except that was kind of the level of what Kameny had to spotlight and cut through. And he really was the perfect person both to cut through the bogus, as he said so well, sleazy, shoddy, shabby pseudoscience, the sort of junk science. He was able to cut through that. And then he and his activist colleagues were able to say, well, actually, there are some controlled scientific studies. Kinsey is one. And Evelyn Hooker, the psychologist, had done this really pioneering research in the 50s, where she took gay men and straight men and gave them these mental health assessments. And to the surprise, I think, of the experts in her world, they couldn't tell the difference between the mental health of the gay men and the straight men through these recognized, you know, measurements. And that was quite determinative and quite strong and rigorous, and had some validity to it as a piece of scientific research. And so there was a body of scientific data that Kameny and the others could point to. And I think it was that scientific argument that ultimately was able to persuade the rank and file APA members to open up their minds and to shift their view. And there was this process of evolving views and dialogue. The APA we could talk about, but John Fryer's, you know, that was a speech at the APA convention. There were other speeches and panels within the world of the APA where people from both sides of this debate came together, had a dialogue, aired their views. And I think the upshot of it was that the rank and file APA members shifted their thinking. They ultimately even had to take a vote, which was a bit of a crazy way to decide what is and isn't a diagnosis, but close to 60% of the APA members ultimately did vote to say that they affirmed and agreed with their own board's decision. And so, of course, there were political tactics involved in terms of protests and amplifying the arguments, but I would say at heart, it was a question about science. And, you know, Kameny and the other activists really made a forceful, positive, and really irrefutable case that homosexuality should not be classified as an illness because there is not scientific data to back up that argument. And then they amplified that through political tactics.
And there had been data for decades that it was not an illness that people had ignored scientifically.
Exactly,
yeah. Patrick, what do you see as the smartest, most strategic action taken by the activists and change makers who challenge the APA? And I've got a question from one of our students to follow up after you answer.
Well, I think, you know, one of the themes of the documentary is the interplay between the insiders and the outsiders, those who were pressuring the APA from the outside to bring about this change in the DSM, and those from working from inside the organization to push for change. And I think it took the work of both to make this happen, because the protests were so important to put pressure on the organization, to galvanize the gay liberation movement, and to embarrass in many ways the APA because of this classification. And then you had the people working from within the organization. I think that was so essential. But for me, I think the brilliant piece of the equation comes down to the activists knowing when to use different tactics. And I think Charles Silverstein pointed this out to us when we interviewed him, is sometimes it was appropriate to storm the stage and take over the microphone and shout at their opponents. But other times they needed to be sitting across the table, making the scientific arguments that Bennett was just alluding to. Because, you know, you couldn't sort of dive into the science the way that they did and meet the APA members on equal ground if they were just screaming and if it was just a one-way conversation. And that was one of the evolutions that the activists went through, where initially they were understandably very angry and wanted to yell and scream and make their voices heard. And that was so important. But then they eventually evolved and understood that it needed to be a conversation, so that the mental health professionals could learn the perspective of the well-adjusted gay and lesbian people, the folks that you know, and Bennett talking about the science, those folks who weren't included in that research that Socarides and Bieber were using to justify the mental illness label. So it really was this evolution in the process where the yelling and screaming becomes a conversation. And there was still some of these tough tactics going on, but it was a willingness to sit across the table and meet these psychiatrists on the ground where this decision would be made. Because even though the activists were morally right and they had the might of right behind them, at the end of the day, they needed to convince them about the scientific case that Bennett alluded to.
Right, thank you. And that leads me to the question that our student Ethan Kramer is asking. He wants to know, do you think the way in which the LGBTQ activists rallied together to fight social injustice also helped the already separated racial groups come together? In other words, how much of an impact do you think this movement affected or helped during the civil rights movement? And any of you, Patrick, Cole, or Bennett?
It's definitely a good question to think about the intersections among the movements. And, you know, we've talked about that with Reverend Kennedy in several panels, because she was a part of the Black Panther Party and part of the civil rights movement. And, you know, she's pretty candid about talking about both racial bias that she experienced within the LGBTQ movement and also some homophobia that she experienced within the civil rights movement. But there is a line in the film where she talks about people coming together. And I think after Stonewall, there was certainly a sense of this opening up of the LGBT movement and this kind of broadening coalition of people coming together, as Reverend Kennedy said, to stand up for LGBT equality. And I think also there was such a long tradition of LGBT people supporting the civil rights movement, sometimes behind the scenes. You know, I did a film about Bayard Rustin, who was in some ways like the iconic, you know, invisible activist within the civil rights movement, who was forced in some ways to sublimate and put, you know, marginalize or put his homosexuality to the side, although that's a complicated story, you know. Yes. but certainly it's true that, you know, Rustin could not be out and loud and proud, to quote you, in 1963 or 1968 or 1970, you know. But so it was an evolving process, but absolutely there were these crossovers and intersections. And I think, you know, as people like Reverend Kennedy demonstrate, there was such, you know, some people were part of both movements, and that sense of intersectionality was very present. And I have to think that led to positive change and positive momentum in both movements because of that crossover. So it is a great question. And, you know, I think there's a lot of, it could be a great research paper or a great book, in fact, something I've been thinking a lot about, like those intersections. And there really isn't a book that focuses exactly on that question. And I think there should be. So maybe the person who asked this has a future ahead in terms of, it's a great question and something that really hasn't been explored fully enough. But so many stories of people who were in both movements and how those lives evolved and how they, you know, to what extent they could be fully themselves in both movements is such a great question.
As Rustin and Reverend Kennedy have been clear in their live story. So what I saw of Reverend Kennedy in this documentary, and then what I know of Rustin, it was not safe to be homosexual during the time that they were fighting for civil rights of, you know, in one respect, and then having to deny who they were, because Reverend Maynard, if I remember correctly from the video, from the documentary, she had 5 kids, right? And so, you know, it wasn't that she had a lot of choices. And Bayard in the civil rights movement, he was instrumental in so many things in the social justice arena, but being fully gay persona, or even, it's not even a persona, it's just who he is, he couldn't be his full self. And
Right.
so, and here we are in this day and age where now we've got not just LGB, we've got LGBT, we've got LGBTQ, IA, plus we've got, you know, additional identities there that back in the 50s would have just not happened. I mean, just it been impossible. And that was, I want to shift the question just a little bit to unpack a little bit about the treatment, because again, we're talking about people who knew fully who they were in a romantic language and sexual orientation and identity, yet the world is not welcoming of any of that. And now, you know, you've got to go through the cure, whatever the, you know, whichever form of the cure it might be for you. And so now, in when you're looking at this film, the fight for LGBTQ equality continues today. So you've picked up information in this documentary from the 50s on up into the current 21st century. But we're still hearing about conversion therapy as a thing, as a cure, as an option. And I know it's mostly in maybe religious or private institutions that it might happen. But can you all talk to me a little bit about what do you see as the most pressing mental health concerns and challenges that face today's LGBTQ youth? And Cole, I want to start with you because I know this is your area.
Things I love about is Patrick and was hope. We hadn't done that, ended it on a positive note. You know, it probably we would have felt like slashing our wrists at the end of the film. But the reality is that while adults have made great progress and we're over a lot of these humps, adolescents are still being subjected every day to conversion therapy. And being in the field of adolescent treatment, I know that we spend a great deal of time treating adolescents for the trauma of having gone through that, more so than whatever other issues they were struggling with that might have brought them into therapy. Frequently, they didn't have any issues at all. It's just that they were LGBT. And it's very frightening because right now, as you know, it's a political issue and it's being argued in many places. Here in California, conversion therapy is illegal. I think Kentucky made it illegal recently. I hope that's the case. But there's still a great deal of work to do around that.
I think you're correct. So not that I want to know all that goes into conversion therapy, but I don't know what exactly it entails. Can you give me some idea of what someone whose parents or loved ones say, you're not supposed to be gay, and we can fix that, and we're going to go through this conversion therapy process. So therapy sounds positive, right? But tell me about conversion therapy.
Well, there's so little real science behind it, just as we see in this film with what was happening with adults prior. It's very difficult for people to justify what they're doing. And what we have found is that it varies dramatically. We've had kids come to us having gone through conversion therapy where they were taken into wilderness programs, where they were stripped of their clothing and left locked in a room for 48 hours, where they were made to sit in a chair for 24 hours and urinate on themselves. It's really outrageous what happens. And while there are laws that prohibit many of those abuses in many states, there are still some states where you can do horrific things, anyone under the age of 18. And then also you have loving families who, with the very best of intentions, because of their religious beliefs, want their children to be straight, and then they're told by people who can allegedly offer some kind of cure, help the young person become straight. They are put in these programs where it involves a lot of praying and guilting, and no change really comes as a result of that. So it's sometimes physical torture and always psychological torture.
It's
And
tragic.
one of the things we've done with the film is since we released it a bit more than a year ago, is we've really wanted to shine a spotlight on the ongoing use of conversion therapy, because I mean, Cole talked about the damage this does, particularly to young people. So this film is not just about the past; it's very relevant to today, particularly around this issue. And the earliest sort of modern day conversion therapy efforts really started in the spring of 1974, after the APA members affirmed the Board of Trustees' vote to remove homosexuality from the Manual of Mental Illnesses. At that point, people like Bieber and Socarides realized they could no longer hide behind the DSM. And so other sort of efforts to, quote, cure started at that point. Organizations like Love in Action and eventually Exodus International created this real cottage industry that flourished. And those organizations are in many ways more in the shadows now than they used to be, which really makes it even harder to track the numbers of people that are being forced to endure this, the damage that's being done. We've worked closely with the Trevor Project and Born Perfect, which are two organizations working nationally to put an end to this practice. And really, we've done our outreach and engagement campaign, which has been supported by, among others, the APA Foundation, has allowed us to do screenings around the country with virtual screenings with various mental health organizations and LGBT groups, many of them shining a spotlight on this issue. We've partnered with AARP, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, Gilead Sciences. This collection of organizations is really heartening to have the support we've received so that we can use this film to educate people. And we're continuing to roll out those efforts now that the PBS broadcast is behind us, so that this film can have a legacy and really continue to be used as an educational tool going forward.
Thank you.
I would just add quickly that, it's also heartening that the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association, really every major medical organization is now on record as saying that conversion therapy is a discredited practice that is harmful and destructive. And so to have those groups on record with that very clear position, I think is important and makes such a impact, it's interesting that as I understand it, 6 countries have banned the practice of conversion therapy nationally. And as we've been saying, in the US so far, it has been a state by state effort. And as I understand it, the majority of states still actually do allow licensed medical professionals to conduct these so-called therapy sessions. And it's growing in terms of the extent of the ban. But if they can do it in Malta and Ecuador and Taiwan, and the UK is in the process of implementing a national ban on this practice, I would like to think that we too could make that happen. And as Patrick said, one of our goals, with this film is to kind of offer the historical context, which is, it's really the same issue, the notion that somebody needs to be cured or changed or converted because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And so I really do think this is a film from history that has an incredible amount of relevance right now.
Yeah. And I did look it up. It's still legal in Kentucky. There were 2 bills that were introduced, but I don't think that they were ever heard. Bill 19 and 30. And so I'm sure that will come back up again, but this is a great way to get some rallying, some social justice energy around it here in the state of Kentucky, in my mind, to make sure the legislation knows that this is something that we want passed. Another question from the audience, this comes from Michael Covert. Thank you very much for your work on this project and telling this very important story. Were there things you had to leave out of the final film, or areas in which you would have liked to spend more time?
Yeah, one of the hardest things is sort of deciding what needs to end up on the cutting room floor. Unfortunately, we didn't have the benefit of doing 10 parts like a Ken Burns film would be able to do. We sort of had to make some really difficult decisions. And one of the challenges in this story is there are so many main characters. That's part of what's so inspiring about the story. It wasn't just one person carrying a flag moving forward. It was this collection of people moving the boat in the same direction. Oftentimes, some of them didn't like each other or necessarily coordinate with each other, but it was this sort of combined effort that moved things forward. But yeah, it was really difficult to decide what to leave on the cutting room floor. The editing process took us about a full year. And I should mention our amazing editor, Steve Hefner. Unfortunately, he passed away from cancer earlier this summer after a courageous battle with cancer. And this film was really a testament to his passion and talent. And, the 3 of us, Ben and I, were working with him and in the edit room, and there were some, how shall we say, spirited discussions about various decisions related to editing. And it was hard to figure out what to leave out. But one story I want to highlight that we would have loved to include, Kayla Husen tells the story of how, in the film, we highlight the story of how she got connected to Daughters of Bilitis and eventually met Barbara Giddings. But we had to leave a sort of bit of that story out, where she was living in Boston, didn't know any other lesbians, and she read this book written by a psychiatrist about how lesbians could get cured. I think the name of the book was called Escape from Lesbos. And she ended up making an appointment to go see this psychiatrist who'd written this book in New York City. She drives from Boston, and I think the way she described it, she puts her $20 on the table and immediately sits down and says, listen, I have no interest in getting cured, but what I'm hoping you can do is tell me how I might meet other women like myself. And the therapist gives her the copy of the magazine from the Daughters of Bilitis. And it's that newsletter, I should say, the newsletter leads her to this picnic in Rhode Island where she meets Barbara Giddings. So just love how the bad guy villain, the psychiatrist, is the one that opens the door to Kay to meet the love of her life. And now it took me 4 minutes to tell the story, and so you can imagine we could have whittled it down, but it just would have been, you have to make choices about what to include.
Right. Let's see, I'm keeping my eye on the time to make sure that I get all the questions that are answered, and then all the ones that I had. So what lessons do you hope viewers will take away from this film? And why is this film relevant today? And I want to know from all three of you. We got time. So Cole, you want to start? Then we'll go to Bennett, then we'll go to Patrick.
Well, for me, it's especially relevant because of what is continuing to happen under the guise of mental health. And, we addressed part of it just now with conversion therapy with adolescents and children. And then in other countries, adults are not hearing as well. And so this is a worldwide human rights issue. And it's no less relevant today than when these activists were busy doing their work. It's just the battlefront has changed. And I think they've given us a nice blueprint here for moving forward. And Patrick and Bennett doing amazing getting that out. It's pay tribute to and know the stories of these people whose shoulders are standing on, but there's just a tremendous amount of work to be done now.
Thank you. Bennett?
I would echo all of that. And I would say another big lesson is really the essential role that allies can play in bringing about change. I think if the only people, in 1972 and 73 who had stood up and said, this really matters, the only people at that point had been the gay psychiatrists, we might well still have a diagnosis of homosexuality in the DSM. But it was people like, as you see in the film, Richard Green, who did this study and really looked at the science and wanted to publish his article, and his mentor said, Richard, you put that in a drawer, because it's how could it possibly help you? And people are going to start to suspect and wonder about your motives, and it's going to taint you, and it's going to really cause problems. And to his credit, Richard Green, who was not shy about saying he was a straight psychiatrist, actually made the decision to publish this article and became an ally in that way, and did I think face some risks, but also spoke truth to power, to use that phrase, and really did something that I think was very powerful in terms of saying, I've looked at this body of evidence and this is my conclusion, and we should talk about it and open it up. And I think he was not alone in terms of becoming an ally and thinking about, again, the science that was involved here, and the basic question within the world of psychiatry, like what should constitute a diagnosis? And if someone is functioning in a healthy and well-adjusted way and has no distress and is not agitated and can, form healthy relationships, why are we calling them mentally ill? So I think within the world of psychiatry, a lot of people did use this as a pivotal moment to think about their system for their work and their role as psychiatrists. And so many allies emerged, and I do think that was crucial, both to this particular campaign and just more broadly to the process of social change. And at the heart, I think, of being a good ally is the very simple but profound piece of listening. Like, don't think you have all the answers, but listen, open your mind, open your heart, open your ears, and then I think positive change can flow from that.
For me, I think building off of what Cole and Bennett said, I think that for me, I hope one of the things that the film does is really inspire people, because I think this really shows that social change is possible. I alluded to it earlier, but when the activists got started, probably 95% of APA members would have thought this was a mental illness. Now, it would be easy to sort of retreat and say, there's just no way we can confront an organization that is so uniformly against us. But the activists like Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings and Reverend Kennedy and the others didn't sort of sit back and sulk, and they stepped forward and they fought one step in front of the other, one day at a time, one conversation at a time. And they eventually created the change they were pushing for using the strategy and the tactics that the film explores and that we've talked about today. And so I hope the film does serve as really a blueprint for how you bring about social change, this mix of insiders and outsiders, this sort of passion and persistence and relying on evidence and facts and trying to move the argument forward. So no matter the issue, no matter the group, I do hope that this film can inspire others to continue the work on a range of areas where social change is needed.
Excellent. Yes. It brings me to a question that I failed to ask earlier, but it's something that Bennett, you mentioned, and it's about the DSM. And so did the DSM change impact psychiatric organizations and societies in other countries, or was it just in the United States?
My sense is that, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, does have quite a global impact. And so there were ripple effects. It wasn't, however, until quite a bit later that the International Classification of Diseases removed homosexuality from its manual. Is it 1990, Patrick?
91, I think.
Yeah, so almost 20 years before there was this official removal of homosexuality from the World Health Organization's manual. And so, of course, that process takes time, and it did result in a positive decision by the authors and editors of the International Manual of the Classification of Diseases. But I think also on a more informal level, the fact that the APA made this decision in '73 really did carry a lot of weight. And psychologically, for one thing, I think gay people around the world felt a different sense of their own dignity and their own sense of themselves. So that is, you can't underestimate that. And then the psychiatric associations in other countries eventually, I think, saw the light and made the official updates to their manuals as well.
But the fight for the DSM continues, right? Because the trans activists, they fought to remove the diagnosis of gender identity disorder in the DSM, but then it was replaced with gender dysphoria, right? And so, why is this diagnosis replaced instead of just removed? So it's like it's a never-ending battle over the DSM and the APA and identifying and still trying, in my mind, still trying to say that there are parts of now homosexuality or parts of now being gay or being lesbian that's still a sickness, right? And still trying
to except it's a little different with trans issues, because in some cases transgender folks want medical treatment, and so to have a diagnosis in the DSM can support them by providing health coverage and reimbursement for treatments like gender affirmation surgery and hormone treatments. I would say what happened was a pretty big shift, because gender identity disorder is saying that the problem that needs to be addressed is about someone's identity, whereas gender dysphoria is saying the identity is not a problem. The problem is sort of the incongruity or the disconnect between a person's gender identity and the gender they were assigned at birth. So that's a pretty big shift. We're saying, the problem is in that dysphoria or that sense of incongruence, not in terms of someone's identity. And so it is an ongoing question, but the pathologization of trans people's lives really did, I think, end when gender identity disorder was taken out.
And to your point, gender dysphoria allows there to be an interaction with the healthcare system.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not about therapy, so to speak, and curing, but more about I've got
affirming. Yeah, right. So it's that, I think it's an important nuance to understand.
Absolutely.
How that functions.
Absolutely. So in my very last few minutes here, because this has been, we could go like another 30 minutes to be honest, because there's lots of stuff to unpack here. Um, my last question for you all is tell us about, and this is for Bennett and Patrick and Cole, if you know as well. The broadcast of Cured on PBS was earlier in the month of October, I do believe. And then, can you tell us what were the reactions when people saw your name, Cole, as executive producer? Did your phone ring off the hook and you get Spielberg deals? What happened there? Tell us, and I know we can still see the video or the documentary on the show and tell, but are there other distribution plans for the film? So Cole, we'll start with you. Are you getting calls from Spielberg?
No, I think Patrick and Bennett are getting the Spielberg calls. So I'm not. My calls came more from people in the mental health world, and so I've been really gratified at people's reactions to the film, and the fact that people are inspired and want to put their energy into things like addressing conversion therapy and the issues we still have today. But Patrick and Bennett can speak much more clearly to sort of where it's being seen, and I know they have some exciting things going on.
Yeah, I'll go first, and Bennett can fill in the gaps. But yeah, the PBS broadcast was really exciting to have a national broadcast for free. It's not as if people need $10 a month on Netflix. So that really was excellent to be the spread all around the country. We got some initial ratings reports, and one of the highest ratings was actually on Mississippi Public Broadcasting. And that's really heartening that the story is reaching places, particularly that still have a lot more work to do when it comes to treatment of LGBT people and pushing for more equal treatment. So that's incredibly heartening. I should say that the streaming window, aside from the show and tell availability through tomorrow, if people miss a chance to watch before then, the film is actually available on pbs.org/cured. And that'll be available till the end of November. So I hope that people will tell their friends and family and spread the word far and wide that the film is still available for people to watch. Additionally, we're working with a distributor in London, and that company has landed broadcast deals in the UK on Sky, also in Italy, Israel, Austria, I think Sweden, hopefully more countries soon. It's been particularly heartening to see this story have an international appeal. I'm not sure I was expecting that. I thought it was sort of too focused on the US to have a much of an audience throughout beyond our borders, but it's been really encouraging to see that, and we hope that it will continue. Additionally, we're working with an educational distributor called Good Docs to reach colleges and universities all around the country and the world in addition, because the educational value of this film is really, there's really no limits to it. So that's a piece of the equation as well. Bennett, I think I've forgotten some pieces. Maybe you can take
I mean, Spielberg, if you're listening, Stephen, my phone is always open. However, but we, on a related note, like the documentary excitingly has been optioned as the basis for a scripted series on FX or Hulu. Stephen Canals, who co-created Pose, is leading that effort, and it's in the early stages, and it's not at all definite that it's going to move into production, but right now there is an option, and I just think it could be such a great fictional scripted series, including and really focusing on John Fryer, to bring it back to the man in the mask, who was the catalyst for this project. Like, if you could script out a scene or an episode or multiple episodes about his life and that day and his decision and how he felt afterwards and how he kept it a secret, I just think there's so much rich potential with the Fryer character and Barbara Giddings and Kamini. It's such a great cast of characters, and I just, I'm very optimistic that ultimately there will be a scripted version which will broaden the audience for the story and spread the inspiration, which is sort of what Patrick and I think I could speak for Cole, hope people take away from this. It's such a heroic story, such a unlikely group of characters and such a triumph, that really made such a difference. And so it's been great to think about, the details of it and also its legacy and why it matters. And it's been such a pleasure to be here with you all and to focus on this piece of history.
Thank you. And if you can get Billy Porter to play Bayard, I'm all for it.
Yes, well, I like the way you think.
So thank you, Cole and Bennett and Patrick, for this very wonderful conversation that we had this afternoon. I appreciate your time. The movie was all that it was said to be. It's fascinating, it's moving, it's riveting. It will make you mad. So it moves you emotionally. I want to thank you again for the great discussion. To my audience, there's still time to see the video, to see the documentary. As Patrick said, pbs.org/cured, and you can see it online and through the month of November. So thank you all, everyone. Transy thanks you. Cole, we miss you. Hopefully you'll come to Lexington sometime soon, and so that we can see your face in 3D instead of 2D.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I end this segment of our time today with a huge thank you to one and all, and you all have a great evening.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.